And I want to start not with the book of Acts. I want to start with the book first. And here's what I would like to do. By the way, if you should have been able to get all of the handouts that we have either on the church app or in an attachment that I sent. Everything that you see up here is in that attachment. You don't absolutely have to have them. Sometimes they're pretty helpful. And a lot of times I've had people come back years later and say, I have this such and such that you did. And I go, really? So they are pretty helpful. And if you want, you can print them or just hold on to them. Now you're probably thinking, why are we looking at this? Well, I'll tell you why. We're going to be reading. And I did say to everyone, I think that our textbook for this class is going to be the Bible. Now we will assuredly bump into some point when I'm going to read something out of one version and somebody's going to go, well, that's not what mine says. So I want to spend a little time on why there's different versions and what that means for us. Let me see. Let's see. I know, Mike, you have New King James? Yeah. Dale? New King James. NIV? ESV. What would you have brought of those?
The NIV, King James, or ESV.
Oh, good. We're going to talk about all those, not to a big degree. Any other different Bibles? That pretty much cover everything?
Message?
Actually, it's on here. What this is a graph that shows. By the way, there are over 450 versions. That's only in English of the Bible. I can't tell you how many there are worldwide, but there are at least 450 different versions of the Bible. So what we have here is kind of a representation of them. And what you're going to see, moving from left to right, is something that's called word for word, or it's also sometimes referred to as formal equivalence. And I'll come back and explain what that is. You move further right on the line, you're going to get to something called thought for thought. That's called functional equivalence. And then all the way to the right is a paraphrase. Down below that are the Bibles and kind of where they fall. Are you with me? In other words, a King James version is going to fall closer to word for word than anything else. If you move further, an NIV is going to be more thought for thought. So it's not that they're telling different stories, they're telling them in a different format. The furthest to the right is something called a paraphrase, and that's where someone, and there's some pretty good ones, a paraphrase where instead of using the actual wording, they're going to paraphrase it in more modern language that we might find it a little easier to understand. So as we go through class, you're going to find if you're using one of the other versions, there'll be something a little bit different. The reality is, in each one of these, the word for word is attempting to replicate the Hebrew and Greek as good as possibly can. As we said on Sunday, for those of you who are Sunday, there's no such thing as a word for word translation. And the reason for that is the differences in Hebrew and Greek. The closest you can get, if you go all the way to the very left, you'll see something called interlinear. An interlinear Bible takes the Greek and it publishes the Greek, and right below that, the translation into English. That's as close as you'll come to a real word-for-word translation of the Bible. I'm often asked, and Alyssa, you had a different Bible, and then did you get the ESV?
Yeah, in the ESV study Bible, like Michael. Or no, you have to. Yes.
Good.
The answer is yes.
Good. That's going to bring up where we're headed next. So here's the reality. You know which one is the very best to use? The one you're going to read, right? That's the best of all these. That's the best. There are some Bibles you don't want to have anything to do with. None of them show up on this list. But the Bible that you want is the one you will read and spend time in. Now, I'm going to suggest if you don't have one, you may want to do this at some point. You may want to, Vanna, if you would be so kind, let me introduce our Vanna for the evening. She's also in the International Bake Off. And So you get to vote for that too at the end of the evening. Hold up the study Bible. You study. Yep, that one. This is one of a number of, this happens to be ESV, one of a number of study Bibles. If you don't have a study Bible, I would suggest you may want to get one. I'm going to pass this around. And what you're going to see is in the study Bible, it's going to have the verses, it's chapters and verses, just like a normal Bible would. But it's going to have a bunch of key notes, and it's going to say what the Hebrew is for this, or what they're saying here, and it's going to give you a key note that's going to make it a whole lot more understandable. The ESV is especially good about kind of introductory articles in terms of here's what Isaiah was talking about, here's the period of time he was talking about it, etc., etc., etc. So if you get a chance, you probably at some point want to get a good study Bible. I have the NIV study. In fact, I have several study Bibles, and they are immensely helpful in hermeneutics, which is just the study of the Bible. So, Deb, if you would be so kind, you got one more. Would you like to tell us what that is?
It's a parallel Bible
And where did we get it?
from the library.
That's I did.
When they have their stamps, when they're getting rid of books that nobody checks out.
You actually, if you get a chance, you want to go to one of these sales, because I got the completed works of Josephus. I got that Bible. I got a number of things from them, and they're like 25 cents. The reason I bring that up is a parallel Bible will take several different versions, and they'll put them side by side. In this case, and when you pass it around, you'll see it. In this case, see if it's Genesis 1:1 and it starts there, then the next version right next to it will be Genesis 1:1, and then right next to that will be Genesis 1 in different versions. So you can read them simultaneously if you want. And most of them, this particular one will give you a word for word, King James. I think that gives you the NIV. That may give you the Living Bible, which is one of the paraphrases. And then I forget what the fourth one is. But the point is, you can see several versions side by side. They're nice to have. I don't know that I'd recommend it unless you really wanted to get into it. Before that, I'd certainly get a study Bible first. So, with that as kind of preliminary, let's move into the book of Acts. And do a little bit of an overview. There's two goals for the class for the next few weeks. And I'd like to tell you how long it's going to be, but I can't because I don't really know. If you're doing exegesis, if you're doing chapter by chapter, verse by verse, you can usually depend on like 1 week per chapter to go through this. But we're going to be pulling out pieces and parts and making connections. So I can't tell you it's going to be a 24-week study. It's going to be as long as it's going to be. And that could be end of next week. But the two things I want to do is, first of all, I want to connect, as we've talked about, connect Acts with what we studied about in the intertestamental period. For those of you who were here for that. And you remember we had three main things that we talked about in the intertestamental period. And those were, in that 400 years, that was God preparing for advent of his son, and then subsequently how the church would grow. So the first thing I want to do is connect the intertestamental period. And we're going to do it looking at three things. You remember one of the things that happened during the intertestamental period was the Greek language became what we would call the lingua franca, the language of the world of the day. That was because of Alexander the Great conquering the known world, and as we talked about before, introducing something called Hellenization. That just meant everything would be Greek. So if you were Hebrew, you learned Greek. If you were Samaritan, you learned Greek. If you were a Tarsan, you learned Greek. So the known world is ultimately going to end up speaking Greek, and that's going to be exactly what happens during Jesus' time, which is why the New Testament is written in Greek. That's the first thing. The second thing that led to this was something called the diaspora. Anybody remember what the diaspora was? Dispersion, yeah. The dispersion of all the Jews from Israel. That's going to start, and we'll look at a little bit more of that later. That's going to start roughly at about 722 BC when the Assyrians come down and conquer northern Israel. And it's going to continue. We'll have a little more discussion on that later. What was the third thing? Does anybody remember what the third thing was that led to the spread of the gospel?
Roads.
Roman roads. Pax Romana, which just meant peace of Rome. When Rome conquers the known world and takes over for the Greeks, they establish the world's best, and to this very day, to some degree, the world's best road system that allowed people to move about. You put all those three things together, and here's what you end up with. When it's time for the spread of the gospel, we have a common language. People can all speak Greek. We have a ready-made missionary force, because in the diaspora, we're going to find Jews from all over, from Israel, from Jerusalem and Israel, scattered throughout the known world. And then finally, we're going to have a way to get to them, which is the peace of Rome. Those are the three critical items that God put in motion for the spread of his message. So we're going to connect those things as we go through this. The second thing we're going to do is highlights of the book itself that may or may not be related to the intertestamental period. It's going to come, as I mentioned Sunday, if you were here, that the Gospels, or that Acts, is really the only book that we have that connects the Gospels to the epistles and to Revelation. If you did not have Acts, you would have some major difficulty in trying to understand what was happening when Paul goes into, let's say, Thessalonica, or when Paul goes into someplace else. You'd have a lot of trouble trying to figure out what was being talked about, because Acts is that link that's going to take the gospel message and tell how it gets dispersed. Now, I used a term, or I think I used this term earlier. If I didn't, I'll do it now. Here's a 25-cent word that you get to keep for free. Exegesis. Exegesis, but just by the word ex, E-X, and exit. Exegesis means to draw out. Eisegesis means to read in. We want to be exegetes. So that means we're going to draw out what the meaning of the Bible is. We're not going to try to make it fit what we want it to fit. That's an eisegete. An exegete is going to take it chapter by chapter, verse by verse, and draw out what that message is. Are you all with me? So from this moment on, you are an exegete. And the reason I bring that up is typically in exegesis, you would do chapter by chapter, verse by verse. By the way, you might find this interesting. I want you to think about this for a minute. Until about the 13th century, there were no chapters in the Bible. Until the 15th century, there were no verses. We did not have chapters and verses until the 13th and 15th centuries AD. That meant that whoever had the Bible, you had to say, you know that part where Isaiah is talking about such and such, go find it. You couldn't say, go to Isaiah chapter 12, verse 1. So typically in a exegetical Bible study, we would do that. We'd go chapter by chapter, verse by verse. We won't be doing that here because we're going to look at the high points. This is what you would think of as more if you ever you were in college and had a survey class, not surveying with an instrument, but surveying of a class itself to familiarize you with it. This would be more of what I would call a survey class, hitting all the high points. So our goals are connect the intertestamental period, and 2, hit the highlights of the book. So let's talk about the book. It was originally called the Acts of the Apostles. In fact, the King James and the Revised Standard, and maybe some of the other versions, still call it that title. It's actually what you might think of as a sequel to Luke's Gospel. In fact, let me just read you the opening to Luke's Gospel and then the opening to Acts, and you'll understand the connection here. This is the opening to Luke's Gospel. Chapter 1, verse 1. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to complete a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. That's the introduction to Luke's gospel. What he's doing here is saying, I'm going to write this gospel, Theophilus, so that you understand what the eyewitnesses saw and have relayed to me. Now let's go look at,
Good question.
yes,
Who was Theophilus?
remember the classification of question that I said we're going to come to that?
Oh, yeah.
We're going to come to that. Because that's a great question. And it's been a question that's been around since the book was written. But we're going to come back to it. You get an A for the question. We'll see what I get for the answer. Now, let me go to the beginning of Acts. I want you to listen to what the beginning of Acts says. In the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and to teach until the day when he was taken up after he had given commands through the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen. So now we've got a book that records, in fact, Luke is one of the only two gospel writers that even records the birth of Christ. We have a book, Luke, that starts with the birth of Christ, and he introduces it, but who does he say he's sending it to? Theophilus, right? Now, after all this period, and Luke probably writes this in the 60s, after this period of time, Luke's going to come back and he's going to say, now, but he writes the two books close in association to each other. Now that I've given you the story of Jesus, now here's the rest of the story. Does anybody remember Paul Harvey?
Yes.
Paul Harvey, if you're old enough to remember him, Paul Harvey used to have a show. It was a great show. He would come in and he'd give you kind of a hook, and he'd say this and this happened to such and such and such and such. And then he'd say, but do you want to know the rest of the story? At which point he usually went to commercial break. And then he'd come back and he'd tell you the rest of the story. That's what's going to happen with Acts. We get the rest of the story. So the evidence that Luke wrote this and to whom he wrote it is pretty convicting. So the evidence in Acts to connect Luke to the Gospels and Acts, and we're going to develop that a little bit more. Luke Acts, the two of them together, is the longest contribution in the New Testament by any single writer. I want you to think about that for a minute. It's about a quarter of the New Testament. In fact, if you took all of Paul's epistles and added Peter's epistles, you still wouldn't have how much you would have in Luke and Acts combined.
Is that saying historically the eyewitness events that happened, is that what you're saying, or volume written material?
Volume of written material. Yep. Bulk is probably a better way to say it. Bulk exceeds the writings of both Paul and John. That makes it even more dramatic because if you think about it, got the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation, all of Paul's 13 epistles. Luke, Acts by bulk, that's a good point, is larger than those combined. And as I said, it forms a critical link between the Gospels, which are the works of Christ, and the apostolic letters, which are the work of the apostles. So the Acts of the Apostles, and we should probably, in fact, let me do this. Let me get there right now. I don't want you to get confused by this because it looks like, actually we used to draw these in engineering to explain how a circuit would work, but this is a little bit different than that. It's the only book of history in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, there are numerous books of history. And the New Testament, the only book that falls into something called the genre, and genre is just a fancy French word. I don't know why the French think they have to come up with fancy words. It just means a type of. So Acts is the only historical book that we have in the church, or in the New Testament, and it's the first church history. I think we'd be at a total loss without this book. So what you're seeing in front of you are the genres of the gospel grouped together so that you understand a little bit more. And this is one of the early things you want to do when you start to read a book, is try to figure out its genre. Because by the genre itself, that's going to give you a bunch of clues to what's in that book. If it's grouped in the Gospels, you know you're going to be dealing mostly with the life of Christ. If it's in Paul's letters, with the exception of something called the pastoral letters, and I'll come back to that, it's going to be primarily a letter written to a specific church for a specific time in a specific era. That doesn't mean it doesn't apply to us today. We talked about that Sunday as well. It still applies to us today because there are principles, but the epistles are going to be a letter, and it's going to look like a letter. In fact, most of them will start out that way. They're going to say, Paul, an apostle to such and such, or Peter to such and such. Hebrews is one of the few that doesn't, which is why it was sometimes questioned. But you get the point. If it's a letter, it's going to read like a letter, and you should think of it like a letter. In the general letters, same thing. It's going to be, but it's not going to be in what's called the Pauline corpus. And then finally, another kind of outrigger is something called apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature is prophecy, but it's, if you've ever tried to read Revelation or the last 6 chapters of Daniel, you'll see these fantastic images that are brought forward to try to paint the image of what they're trying to do. So to go back to Acts, to go from the life of Jesus to the gospel, and the gospels to the epistles, it'd be a pretty big leap. It's a bridge not only between the life of Christ and the Christ life taught in the epistles. It's also a transitional link between Judaism and Christianity, and between law and grace. Are you following me with that? In other words, we're going to move from Judaism. In fact, in Acts, in the first part of Acts, we're going to spend some time in Judaism still, because originally Christianity was thought to be just a sect of Judaism. Rome thought, oh, that's just another part of Judaism. We don't need to worry about those guys. It's going to emerge. So eventually it's going to emerge from Judaism to Christianity. It's going to emerge from law to grace. So those transitional links are critical in the book of Acts. Let's see. Authorship. Yeah.
You addressed the Oculus first?
I did not, but I can.
I thought you would. I'm sorry.
I'm going to, but hold on just a minute. Since it seems to be such a burning issue, I will do that because I don't want to leave you hanging. In fact, I probably should, Dale, because it's not going to come up until next week when we talk about Theophilus. So let me tell you who Theophilus was. Dale, in addition to being a good prayer, also is assigned second position in keeping me on track. First position, Van White. So Theophilus, the name actually translates one who loves God. Theo and Philos. That's the way it translates. Some have tried to make the case that it's really addressed to all Christians. Probably not. In fact, almost assuredly not, because you'll notice he says, most excellent. In other words, he gives him a title. Most excellent Theophilus. So it would be like saying Captain Quaid or something like that. So it's probably an individual, and probably the patron of Luke, who copied and published the writings. There you will continue to try to find people make a connection with Theophilus as just God lovers, meaning all of us, but the reality is it probably wasn't. And it may have been. There's even been some postulate that it was Paul's attorney when he was under Roman arrest. That's all conjecture. Nobody can prove it one way or another. The only thing that's relatively certain is that most people agree on, is that this is a man named Theophilus who's in a high position somewhere and likely able to fund Luke's writings and maybe some of his trips. That help? Good. Patron, yeah. Yeah, that'd be a good word you could use for it. Dale, that was probably a good thing we did that, because we wouldn't get to it till next week. Alyssa would go home so frustrated. She said, I still don't know who Theophilus is. Now we know. How about the authorship? Well, there never really was a debate on who the author was. It was always considered to be Luke. You will see, if you want to go research this, just type in who wrote Acts, you're going to get all kinds of stuff. And there will be detractors who say, no, it wasn't Luke because of this and this and this and this. Here's the problem with that. There is so much external, which we'll come to later, and internal evidence that that Luke writes it, that it's almost impossible not to assign it to Luke. Let me give you 4 facts on the evidence. Here's the first. In the beginning of Acts, the writer specifically refers to an earlier work also dedicated to Theophilus. I just got through reading that, right? So we know that at a minimum, it's the same writer for these 2 books, right? Because he tells you, here's what it is. Luke 1:1-4 shows that the 3rd gospel is the account that is meant when it says, in my former book. Secondly, the style, outlook, vocabulary, apologetic emphasis, and many small details that tie the 2 works together are manifest throughout all the books. Were it not for the desire to have Luke with the other 3 Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, it probably would have been taken as 2 books together, kind of like 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Well, the reason they aren't is because Luke is linked with the Synoptic Gospel. Synoptic meaning seen together. If you've ever read the Gospels, you probably have read Matthew, and then you get to Mark, and you're like, didn't I just read this? Well, very similar, right? And then you get to Luke, and say, didn't I just read this? And the commonalities among them are probably because there was a single source to begin with. Some would say it was Mark, and then Matthew and Luke wrote subsequently. Some would say it was Matthew. I personally think it was Matthew. And that the other 2 synoptics wrote from that same work. Luke is the one who goes on, though, and he says, not only did I use these sources, I went out and investigated all the other sources. Luke is probably the most historically accurate book in the New Testament. Because Luke doesn't just take other writings, he goes back and investigates Greek and Hebrew and things that happen.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you, in my opinion, as I'm listening to you, because he's a physician, he documents, as a physician, has that training, and has that training to do all of that research, that's just part of his discipline. Therefore, that's why would it educate him?
I don't think that's a bad thought. Now, here's the part with the bad thought. Have you ever tried to read a doctor's writing?
Yes.
But that's a good point, and that's one of the points that's made. And we're going to come back to that here. In fact, one of the reasons that we're going to call Luke the writer is Paul refers to him. He says the good Dr. Luke. So we'll come back to that as well. Here's the second reason, though. From the text of Acts, it's clear that the author was Paul's traveling companion. And we'll see this in what's called the famous we sections. When we get to chapter 16, the point of view is going to move from 3rd person, when Luke is talking about it, to 1st person, or 1st person plural, when he says, we did this. We is, at this point, including Paul, Timothy, Luke. In other words, somebody that was there as an eyewitness watching it occur. So the author is actually present at the events. The 3rd point is Luke is mentioned in 3 of Paul's prison letters, Colossians, Philemon, and 2 Timothy. I should point out that 2 Timothy isn't normally grouped, and I'll explain what a prison letter is here in a minute. 2 Timothy is not normally grouped with the prison letters. The reason for that is it's what's called a pastoral letter. The pastoral letters are 1st and 2 Timothy and Titus. The reason they're called that is Paul's on his way to martyrdom, and he's taken his 2 young proteges aside, and he's pastoring them so that they are able to take over the churches when he leaves. So they're called the pastoral epistles. 2 Timothy, though, is written when Paul is in prison. In one of 2 places. In Rome, likely, but the first imprisonment is under house arrest when he's allowed to kind of move around. The second is what's called the Mamertine prison, where it's a deep, dark hole. Luke is mentioned in those 3 letters specifically. And Paul says, if it weren't for Luke, I wouldn't have this and this and this. Luke is the only one with me, just before his death. The prison letters, by the way, if you want to look here, they are Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Paul writes all of those letters, and the letter to the Colossians, he's never been to Colossae. So he's writing to a church established by somebody else. And if you read the epistle accounts, he's talking to each of these about specific issues going on. He's writing it from prison in Rome. That's why they're called the prison letters. So that's the third reason. Here's the fourth and final one. When everybody else, all the companions of Paul who are mentioned by the author, and the third person are eliminated, as well as companions known not to have been with Paul during the we sections, Luke's the only one left. So by all internal evidence, Luke must be the writer of the book of Acts. Everybody follow me? Let's see, what about the date of writing? Also controversial. You ever come across anything in the Bible that isn't controversial? Somebody's always trying to cause problems with it one way or another. Let's talk about the date. While the date in some New Testament books isn't absolutely critical, it is in Acts. Why would that be?
Talking about the growth of the church, that be somewhat chronological.
If it's a historical book, it has to reflect the period of time, right? So the time of Acts is critical in terms of a couple of things. First of all, what was going on in the book of Acts. Secondly, that's one of the ways we can date when the Gospels were written. Because we don't know for sure when the Gospels were written either. Now, I'm going to put up a slide here that you're going to go, what in the world is that? Would you like to, anybody want to interpret what all this is? This is a timeline starting at 30, so we'll call it around the crucifixion, resurrection, and going all the way to the year 100. So it's a 70-year period of time on the timeline. You see the little green dots down below the timeline? One of them says Mark, one of them says Matthew, one of them says Luke, and one of them says, you see those? That's what I would call, what most Orthodox belief is, the time that these were written. Once again, you're going to get, because like where you see Luke here with the big, I know, let me see if I can get over here. You see Luke right here? There are people who will say Luke could have been written anywhere in this period of time up until about 85. It had to be written before 84 because he dies in 84. But there are detractors who will say, no, it didn't get written until here and here and here. Same thing is true of Matthew and John. John did get written later. You can see his little dot right there. The traditional Orthodox view is that all of these books were written in the late 50s, early to mid 60s. And I'll tell you why that's true. Especially with Luke. And with Acts. If we can establish when Acts was written, what do we know? Luke had to be before, don't we? Because he told us. He said in my previous book, right? So if we can establish when Acts was written, then we can say when Luke was written within some range. And if Luke borrowed from both Matthew and Mark, they had to have been written before Luke. That makes sense? But there's a couple of things that are even more important, and that's this. Here's the first point. Silence about later events.
All of Jerusalem was never mentioned.
Exactly.
So it had to be prior to that.
That's a very good point. Had to even be
like
prior.
Nero and all that stuff happened as well. It had to have been prior to that.
Correct. Not only that, it had to be prior to 66 AD, because 66 is when the revolution begins.
66?
66 is the beginning of the Jewish Revolution that culminates, well, there'll be the fall of Jerusalem, and then in 73, Masada. But
Okay.
66, and there's no mention of that. That's a pretty big deal, don't you think? If I'm a historian, Am I not going to say something about that? Unless my book ends before that period of time, right? That's one of the things. The burning of Rome isn't discussed. Persecution of Christians isn't discussed. Destruction of Jerusalem isn't discussed. Nero isn't discussed. Nero dies in 64. So none of those kind of big issues were discussed. You know, it would be like writing a history of the United States and failing to mention the Twin Towers. That means that you must have written that book before, or you're grossly ignorant. The other thing is, that's the first thing, Mike. The second thing is, there's no outcome of Paul's trial in Rome. When we get to the end of the book, you're going to go, man, it just stops. And it kind of does. If you are one of the closest associates to Paul, are you not going to write about the trial and subsequent results of the trial of somebody who's going to be martyred, have their head cut off? I think you probably would. So those two things together and a number of other reasons, are the probability for why we have to set Luke at 63, around 63, call it 63, 62, 63, maybe 64. You cannot set it any later, my way of thinking, because of those two. If the Jewish revolt happens in 66 and Paul is martyred in 68, that means that Luke had to have written Acts earlier than that. It also means he had to have written Luke earlier than that. It also means Matthew and Mark had to have been written earlier than that. But I will tell you right now, if you go home tonight, and I'm sure that's what you're going to do, and you get on your computer and say, when were the Gospels written? You're going to get somebody that's going to say they weren't written until 100 AD. And they were written by a bunch of guys that didn't know what they were talking about. Well, the good thing about the internet is any fool can get on it. Let's see. I want to try to wrap up our intro here. The purpose for writing. Generally, the purpose of Acts is described as twofold. First, present an accurate history of the early church. Second, present an apologetic. Don't get in your mind, I'm apologizing. In Greek, the term apologia simply means a defense. So what Paul is doing, I'm sorry, I keep saying Paul. For those of you who are new here, you need to understand that what you need to do is know what I'm wanting to say, whether I say it or not. That makes sense? So Luke does an early, the best written defense of the early church. The New International Version lists 4 reasons. First is this, that he writes, to present a history. Significant in Acts, as we've already talked about, is the historical account is paramount. And it's the accurate account of the first 30 years of the way, including the founding of the church, spreading the Gospels, beginning of congregations, evangelistic efforts, unique aspects of Christianity. All of those are developed in the book of Acts. Now, I used a term here just a minute ago. I said the 30 years of the way, right? What does that mean? That's right. It's not until Antioch, and we'll get to Antioch here, 20 years after the crucifixion and resurrection, that the term Christian is even developed. Up to that point, they were called members of the way. I am the and the light, right? So that's why they were called the way. This is the first 20 years of that, first 30 years of the way is what Luke is going to be writing about. Now, while we're there, we might as well just do this other slide. If you haven't printed these out yet, and it costs about $20 if you take them to Office Depot. If you give them to Deborah, she'll do it for $15.95. If you haven't printed them out, you may want to, just so you can kind of leaf through and look at them. This is kind of the timeline of the book of Acts, and it's going to start with the ascension, which we'll talk about, And it's going to work through the timeline of everything that occurs up until 70 AD. Again, this is going to be what I'm going to call the orthodox. Orthodox means right thinking. It's going to be the orthodox view of how the book of Acts unfolds. You'll notice something if you walk your way down here a little bit, and we'll come back and develop it further. About halfway down, we see mostly Peter's involvement. From that point on, we see mostly Paul's involvement. The book of Acts, when it says Acts of the Apostles, it's really not. It's the Acts of 2 apostles. The others kind of have a minor role, and we'll talk about them here in just a second as well. But it's really the Acts of Peter and the Acts of Paul. So it's the Acts of the early church, as it was considered just a sect of Judaism, and then when it becomes the Christian church. That timeline will be, and we'll probably come back to that timeline several times as we walk through what's happening here. So, as I said, the NIV says the purpose of the writing, first of all, is to present a history. Secondly, to give a defense. Embedded in Acts is a record of the Christian defense made both to Jew, which we'll see in chapter 4, and to Gentiles, which you'll see in Acts 25, with the overall purpose being conversion. You think there's only 3 groups of people that we're concerned about here. One is a Jew. One is what I'm going to call a completed Jew, a Jew who has said Jesus Christ really is Lord and Savior. And the third one is, were some of you here Sunday? Well, most of you were here Sunday. Yeah, when I talked about in Navajo, you were the Dene, or you were everything else. In Hebrew, it's the same thing. You were either Jew or you were cast into everything else. That meant all Gentiles. And you'll sometimes see the word Greek used instead of Gentiles, but it basically meant everyone else. So the defense then would have been, or the apologia would have been, Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. Exactly what Paul's task was. The third reason the third purpose behind it was to provide a guide. Acts sets out the basic principles for dealing with problems and persecutions experienced by the early church that are also applicable today. I don't know how many of you have been keeping up with the genocide in Africa, a number of places. That's exactly what was happening in the first century. When Nero comes to power, Christians were persecuted right and left. And there's a number of good historic resources that talks about Nero would take Christians, sew them into animal skins, bloody animal skins, and then turn them loose in front of a bunch of lions and tigers that would hunt them down. Or he would cover people in pitch and use them as torches. That's the kind of thing that was happening in this period of time. Same kind of thing that we see to some degree today. So the third point was to provide a guide. And finally this, to depict the triumph of Christianity in the face of bitter persecution. Success in the spread of the new church from Jerusalem all the way to Rome proved that it wasn't a mere work of man. God had to be in that. So those are the reasons, or the purposes behind behind the writing of the book of Acts. Characteristics, a couple of them. First of all, as I said earlier, is the most historically accurate book that you'll find. Actually, it's not just the most historically accurate book you'll find in the Bible. It's one of the most historically accurate books you find in all history. Sorry? Oh, I thought there was a question. There are at least 2 Roman historical sources, Tacitus and Suetonius, who are Roman historians. They corroborate key events of figures mentioned in Acts, such as political shifts in power, social customs. They record the actions of Roman governors like Felix and Festus, who we'll talk about. So these are Roman historians who have no reason to make a case for Christianity, corroborating what Paul is telling us. We also have Jewish historical sources. Josephus talks about James being martyred. And he doesn't spend a whole lot of time on Christ. In fact, he says James, the brother of Christus, was martyred, and he goes on to talk about what a good man James was. So now we have a Roman historian, a Jewish historian who certainly didn't have anything he wanted to invest in Christianity, and then finally a bunch of non-biblical inscriptions and archaeological discoveries that provide striking confirmation to details in Acts. There's something called a Gallio inscription, was found in Delphi. It confirms the exact timing of Paul's stay in Corinth, which we'll see in Acts 8, helping to anchor Paul's missionary journeys in a precise historical framework. So the characteristics of the book, being accurate history, are corroborated by all kinds of sources, not just biblical sources. That's the first thing. Literary excellence, and this goes back to what you were saying about about Luke, likely being a doctor. The style of writing and vocabulary are used to fit the events that he's recording. In some cases, he's going to use classical Greek. In some cases, he's going to use Aramaic. In some cases, he's going to use first century, what would have been called a first century Palestinian language. So he used the language and idioms appropriate to the places he describes. The other two major issues for him are his dramatic accounts, his skillful use, and his objective account. And when I say objective account, I want to point this out. He's accurate in portraying some things that are kind of in a bad light with the church. You know how I know the Gospels, you know how I know the whole Bible is accurate? If I were writing the Bible, you wouldn't find out about David and Bathsheba. You wouldn't find out about all the bad stuff. All I'm going to give you is the good stuff, which makes me a pretty bad historian. Luke talks about the discord between Grecian and Hebraic Jews. We'll deal with that a little bit when we get to the martyrdom of Stephen. He talks about the discord between Paul and Barnabas. So he doesn't try to paint over the trials and tribulations. He gives an objective account. All right, we are doing so good. I might just slow down. Let's look at the outline for just a second. I sent this out, but then I also made some copies. And let me tell you kind of how we're going to approach this. You'll notice there's a number of lines that are printed in red. So here's what I'd like to do, and I give you kind of a legend down at the bottom that tells you what it means. The red print are sections to be read before class, and then the italics are portions of that section to be discussed in class. So let's look at the first one as an example. The apostles' witness in Jerusalem. Sometime between now and next week, I'd like you to read through those 6 chapters. First of all, Acts is a great read. I mean, it's a novel. So I think you'll enjoy reading it. But then when we come back next week, we're not going to talk about everything. We're going to pull out the important pieces. You'll notice in italics, we're just going to look first at the Ascension, chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. And that's all we're going to talk about in that chapter. You're going to have read the whole chapter. And if you have questions about it, that's the time to bring them up. But we're going to focus on the important pieces of the chapter, the Ascension first. Then we move on to the birth of the church at Pentecost. The church of the birth at Pentecost, there are going to be so many ties to what we studied in the intertestamental period that when we finish that section, there's going to be a test. So you can see we're going to do a major portion of chapter 2, but not all of it. Then we're going to skip to chapter 4, talk about Peter and John before the Sanhedrin. And a bunch of you know what the Sanhedrin is, don't you? Because we talked about how the Sanhedrin came into existence during the intertestamental period. Then we'll talk about how the apostles were persecuted, leadership of the infant church, etc. So we're going to read everything from chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 6, verse 7. but we're going to discuss just the stuff that I have in italics. Then we'll move on to the early church's witness to all Judea and Samaria. Everybody following me? All that makes sense? It doesn't make sense to what it doesn't make sense to do. Oh, no, this does. Don't worry about me. I'll just talk amongst myself. There is one more thing. If this book is about 2 apostles, what happens to the rest of them? You ever wonder about that? Where the rest of them end up? Well, I just happen to be able to tell you. What happened to the apostles? This is where, and I will tell you, this is church history. It will tell you this. You aren't going to find this in the Bible. Church history will tell you where each of these ultimately ended up. I have a great book at home called What Happened to the Apostles. It talks about their death, where they went to preach, etc. For instance, Thomas ultimately is going to end up in India. So this would be a map that you'll probably want to look at just to see what happens to all of them. Because we don't really get much. What we get is Peter and Paul. Well, there's a bunch of other ones out there, so where are they and what happened to them? You may want to look at this map if you get a chance, and it may even give you some resources where you can find them. Let's see. I think that's everything for the night. Questions, comments, thoughts? Dale?
So that's James the Apostle, not brother.
Correct.
He ends up in Spain.
Now again, Dale, and I'll tell you how some of this happens, by the way. When I say it's church history, you know what you tend to find? Like in India, there is a church called, I don't remember the exact name of it, basically it's a Church of Thomas. And it was dedicated to Thomas because he was there. Same thing would have been true of James. Same thing would have been true. So a bunch of them, and the churches, some of those churches still exist today. A bunch of it comes from history, not just from church history, but from geographic history from these areas. Now, can I swear they're all completely accurate? No.
Didn't Thomas convert a bunch of people down there? King, and he did a healing on the king's daughter or something like that, so she converted. And something to that effect.
And you'll find a lot of that kind of church. That's one thing that, now I'm not even going to refer to pseudepigraphal books because they don't do a very good job of telling that. But what does do a pretty good job of telling that is the early church fathers. Polycarp, as an example, can tell you just about everything that happened to John the Apostle because he was one of his students. So a lot of what we see about the lives is, you won't see anything about them except Peter and Paul in Acts. You won't really see much of anything about them. Well, we do know this. 1st and 2nd Peter, he's probably writing from either Ephesus or Rome, so we know he gets there. And he's writing to churches in Turkey. So that kind of helps us get an idea. The point is, they didn't retire and just never show up again. They did exactly what Jesus said. Take my message to the ends of the earth. All right.
I have a question. I don't know if you can answer this. This is a kind of a big general question I've always had. I've always wondered how Luke and Mark had enough authority to be in the Bible when they weren't disciples.
Good question. And the reason is, mostly give you this rationale. When you're reading the Gospel of Mark, you're really probably reading the Gospel of Peter.
I followed him.
Mark was what's called an amanuensis. That just another big fancy word for kind of reporting secretary. So he was, and with Paul, it's the same situation. Paul had Timothy, he had Barnabas, he had a number of people. Luke, he had a number of people. So with specifically Mark is probably because of the authority of Peter. With specifically Luke is probably because of the authority of Paul. That's why they would have been included in the Gospels. It is interesting, though, don't you think, that of the Gospel writers, only 2 of them are apostles, Matthew and John. But that's important for another reason, and that is this. who better, because Luke's gospel is considered a gospel to the Gentiles, who better to write a gospel to the Gentiles than a Gentile? So that's the short answer is Mark and Peter, Luke and Paul. That help?
Yeah.
You buy that?
She's
Yeah.
not gonna call you a liar to your face.
That's good.
Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Just curious, do people in India take Thomas as a last name? Because I know some Thomases that are Indian descent, they're Indians.
Wow.
I always thought it very odd, it's not an Indian name.
That's a good question. That falls in the.
ChatGPT.
That falls in. The good news is I know they aren't going to be here next week. So you'll have to mail it in.
We'll get back to you on Sunday.
Yeah. But it is a good question. We'll wait for the answer, won't we? Any others?
I can make some copies of these if you want me to bring copies of the slides that you made. I printed a bunch.
Oh, did you?
I mean, I printed mine, but I can print more if someone would like.
Does anybody want them, or can you do your own?
Okay.
I tell you what, let's do this. Why don't you do like 5?
Okay.
Bring them in, and if they're getting $19.95 at Office Depot, sell them for $10. Others?
Is Josephus just a historian, a Jew that didn't believe in Christ? Where he kind of falls in? Is he just a historian, or is he like a good Jew, or is he a Christian, or?
Definitely not a Christian, a good Jew. Josephus was born about the time that Christ dies. He lives from about 30 to about 100 AD. Josephus was from the priestly line, so I think he's a priestly line, so he is definitely Jewish. But Josephus is one of the guys. I'm sorry? You know, I can't swear to that, Mike, so let's not hinge our star on that one. Yeah. I want to tell you something that's inaccurate. I've never done that before. But what happens with Josephus is Josephus becomes a general in the Israeli army when they revolt in 66. And he's sent to Galilee, and one of the first places that Pompey conquers is Galilee. And Josephus knows, he sees at the time, this is not going to turn out well. Josephus goes back to his Jewish brothers and says, guys, we're going to lose this. We better just bend our knee to Rome for now and see what happens. As a result, he becomes ingratiated to some degree with Romans. So he's the one who will be asked to, and he wants to write the history, the Jewish wars, the life of Josephus. So he is primarily a historian, but most definitely a Jewish historian, and probably more of a Roman bent.
Okay.
That help?
Yeah. Well, we're always talking about him, I just didn't know, he was Jewish, but I didn't know if he was, I didn't think he was on board with Christianity,
No.
so I was just curious. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, why don't we end tonight then with a. I'm sorry?
ChatGPT, yes.
That's the answer, yes. All right.
They're not descendants of Thomas, but because of the churches he founded and the Christianity and the spread of that, people took that name.
No kidding. Wow, there we have our answer.
ChatGPT.
After I get through recording, I'll have to tell you about my experience with ChatGPT.
Always suspect.
Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Then I think to end tonight's show, Vanna should do a rousing closing prayer. Would you?